What happens when a cold-hearted CEO rejects his secretary's love, only for her to rise to unimaginable success, leaving him at her mercy a decade later? He walked out of her life, leaving her heartbroken and ignored. But 10 years later, the tables were flipped. She was now in control, and he had no choice but to walk into her office as her employee. Will he ever get a second chance at love, or will he have to face the consequences of his actions? Welcome to a world of untold stories and shocking truths. Some secrets change lives forever, and this one just might. Let's begin. It had been years since Elena had seen him. 10 years to be exact. The man who once had her heart, who had turned. His back on her when she needed him most, was no longer the cold, distant CEO she remembered. In fact, he was barely a shadow of the man he used to be. The harsh, sharp lines of power that had once defined his presence had faded, replaced by something softer, more uncertain. Her office door opened with a faint creak, drawing her attention from the stack of files before her. A figure stood at the threshold, tall and familiar, yet almost unrecognizable. His once pristine suit was a bit disheveled, his tie askew, his hair thinner than it used to be, streaked with traces of silver. She had to blink twice before she was sure her eyes weren't playing tricks on her. "Mr. Warren." Eleanor's voice was steady, but her heart raced in her chest. The man who had once made her feel invisible was standing there, not as her boss, not as the CEO of one of the largest corporations in the country, but as someone who seemed lost. Vulnerable even. Jason Warren, the same man who had rejected her love all those years ago, the man who had made her feel like she wasn't even worth a glance, stood before her, his expression tense. "Miss Daniels," he said, his voice a little quieter than she remembered, almost as if he weren't sure of his own presence. I need your help." The words hit her like a slap. She swallowed hard, struggling to maintain her composure. "My help?" she repeated, incredulous. The memories of how he had coldly dismissed her love, the way he had turned her away without a second thought, came rushing back in a flood of bitterness. But it wasn't just bitterness she felt. It was also the sting of pride, of having built a life for herself far beyond the man who had rejected her. "What is it that you need?" Elena asked, her tone carefully controlled, though inside her mind was racing. What could he possibly want from her after all this time? Was this some kind of sick joke? I lost everything," Jason continued, his voice cracking just slightly. "The company, my reputation, my wealth. I need to start over. I need work, and I heard you were successful now, that you might be able to help me." Her gaze narrowed. The man who had once made her feel small, insignificant, now stood in front of her, asking for her assistance. She could feel her pulse quicken as the realization settled in. He wasn't here as her superior, demanding her respect. He was here as someone who had fallen from grace, desperate and humble, and in need of the very person he had once so cruelly ignored. "You want my help," Elena repeated, trying to steady her emotions. "After everything you did?" Jason's eyes darkened with regret. "I know I hurt you, Elena. I know I was wrong, but I'm not the same man I was back then. Stop," she interrupted, holding up her hand. Don't pretend like you suddenly care about how I feel." She leaned back in her chair, her expression hardening. "What's done is done. You made your choice." Jason's shoulders slumped. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I need work. I need to earn my way back. Please, can you help me?" Elena sat in silence for a long moment, her fingers drumming lightly against the edge of her desk. The tables had turned. He was no longer the powerful CEO looking down at her. Now, he was the one who needed something. She could see the desperation. In his eyes, the way he had humbled himself by coming to her of all people. It should have felt satisfying, but it didn't. It didn't feel like victory at all. Instead, it felt like an opportunity, a dangerous one. Finally, Elena spoke, her voice cold but her mind racing. "I'm afraid I'm not in the habit of giving second chances, Mr. Warren, not to people who've rejected me." Jason seemed to shrink back, the weight of his regret heavier than she had ever seen, but there was something else in his eyes, now determination. "Please," he whispered again, Give me a chance. I'll work hard. I'll do whatever it takes. She could see that he was genuine, but that didn't change the past. The scars he had left on her were still there, even if they were hidden beneath the surface. She wasn't sure if she was ready to forgive him, but one thing was clear. This was no longer about love. It was about power. And for the first time in years, Elena had the upper hand. Elena's gaze lingered on Jason for a moment longer. She saw the vulnerability in him, but she also saw the man who had once dismissed her, who had treated her as nothing more than a cog in his vast empire. It was hard to ignore the history between them, the way he had used his power to control their lives, never once thinking about the emotional damage left in his wake. But now, standing before her, he was no longer a towering CEO. He was just another man struggling to survive, and he was asking for her help. "All right," Elena said, her voice sharp. "I'll help you, but don't expect anything easy." Jason blinked as though he hadn't quite believed she would agree. "You'll help me?" She nodded, not even a hint of a smile crossing her face. "I'm a businesswoman, Mr. Warren. I don't do charity. If you want my help, you'll have to prove yourself. Your pride doesn't matter anymore. You'll start from the bottom, just like everyone else. If you can handle that, then maybe we'll talk." Jason's face betrayed a mixture of relief and apprehension. "I understand. I'll do whatever it takes." Helena's eyes softened for a brief moment, but only for a moment. She didn't trust him, not yet. The years of bitterness and regret were far too fresh. It would take time to untangle the threads of resentment, but perhaps this was a good place to start. Maybe there was something about redemption she could believe in. She stood up from her desk, her heels clicking sharply on the polished floor as she walked toward the office door. "Follow me," she said, her voice firm. "I'll show you where you'll be working." Jason's eyes widened. "You mean here? At your company?" Elena nodded, her back turned to him as she led the way through the sleek, modern hallways. The contrast between the two of them couldn't have been starker. She had built this place from the ground up, slowly earning every bit of success with hard work, sharp decision-making, and a relentless focus on her goals. She had transformed herself from the overlooked secretary into a powerful business owner. Respected by her peers and feared by her competitors, she had earned every ounce of her power. Jason, on the other hand, had once wielded power without regard, throwing his influence around like it was an extension of his will. And now he was here, following her lead, not as a peer, but as a subordinate. Her footsteps echoed as they walked past rows of glass-walled offices, the hum of busy employees filling the air. Jason's eyes darted around nervously, a stark contrast to his former confident self. He was out of his element, and Elena could see it. For the first time in years, she had the upper hand. It felt strange, unsettling even. They reached a small windowless office near the back of the building. It was a far cry from the corner office Jason had once occupied, but Elena had chosen it intentionally. This was his first step, no special treatment, no shortcuts. He needed to prove himself. "This is where you'll be working," she said, pushing open the door. "You'll start by managing administrative tasks, helping with data entry, and working on project proposals. You'll earn your keep here, one task at a time. If you think you can't handle it, now's your chance to walk away." Jason swallowed hard, but he didn't hesitate. "I'll do whatever it takes, I swear." Elena didn't say anything more. She turned to leave, her gaze meeting his for a brief, cold moment before she stepped back into the hallway. There was no warmth in her expression, no hint of the person she had once been, the secretary in love with a man who never saw her for more than a tool to get things done. That woman was gone, replaced by someone stronger, more focused, more guarded. Jason's fate was no longer in her hands, but how he handled the tasks ahead of him would determine just how long he could survive in her world. And if he thought this would be an easy road, he had another thing coming. Eleanor walked back to her office, her mind already working on the next steps for her business. Jason was a distraction, a reminder of the past she was trying to leave behind. But his presence also ignited something within her, a fierce determination that she hadn't realized she still had. She had built this empire without him. She didn't need him, but if he was willing to prove himself, she might just allow him to play a small part in her future. The question remained, could Jason Warren Really change? Or would he prove to be the same man who had once rejected her, forever doomed by his pride? Days passed and Jason settled into his new role. At first, he was a model employee, punctual, diligent, and eager to prove his worth. Elena observed him closely from her office, her sharp eyes catching every small detail. She wasn't easily fooled. She had seen men like Jason before, men who could put on a mask of humility when they needed something, only to revert to their true selves once they thought they had regained control. But something about him felt different this time. Jason worked long hours, staying late to finish assignments and taking on extra tasks without complaint. His office, which had once been a symbol of his dominance, now felt like a prison, small, cramped, and far from the luxury he had once been accustomed to. Every morning, Eleanor watched as he walked past her office on his way to his cubicle, his posture stiff but determined, as if the weight of his past was constantly pressing down on him. He never complained, never asked for special treatment, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the subtle signs of a man who was struggling to adjust to a life he had never envisioned for himself. Elena, however, remained distant. She kept her interactions with him strictly professional, offering no sympathy, no kindness. There was no room for personal emotions in her world. Jason had made his bed, and now he had to lie in it. One afternoon, a week into his new position, Jason knocked on her office door. Elena barely looked up from her laptop as she gestured for him to enter. "Miss Daniels, I've finished the project proposal you requested," he said, his voice steady, but his eyes betraying a flicker of uncertainty. "I think it's ready for review." She nodded without acknowledging the effort he had put in. "Leave it on the desk," she said, her tone impassive. Jason hesitated for a moment, then placed the folder on her desk. As he turned to leave, Elena's eyes followed him. He had changed. His arrogance was gone, replaced by something quieter, more introspective. She couldn't deny that a part of her was impressed. He had embraced the grind of a job that most people in his position would have considered beneath them. But Elena was not one to be moved by pity or nostalgia. She had learned long ago that success came from strength, not from the past. Later that day, Eleanor reviewed the proposal. It was good, better than she expected. Jason had managed to take an idea she had suggested and turn it into something practical, something with real potential. It wasn't the kind of work that would change the course of the company, but it was solid. It was the kind of work she could rely on. For the first time since he had joined, Elena felt a shift in her feelings. It wasn't enough to change everything, but it was a start. That evening, she asked him to stay late. Jason looked up from his desk, surprised but not unwilling. He wasn't the type to shy away from hard work. "I need you to work on the financial report for the next quarter," she said as she handed him a thick binder. "I don't want any mistakes. I want this done tonight." Jason didn't flinch. "Of course. I'll get to it right away." He worked late into the night, and Elena stayed in her office, pretending to focus on her own tasks, though her mind kept drifting back to him. What was it about Jason that was different now? Was it just that he was humbled by his fall from grace, or was there something more, something beneath the surface? It wasn't just his work ethic that had changed. There was a quiet sadness in his eyes now, something raw and honest that she hadn't seen before. But Eleanor wasn't the kind of person to offer comfort. She had learned the hard way that nobody, least of all her, could afford to show vulnerability. As the clock ticked past midnight, Elena heard the sound of Jason's chair scraping across the floor. She looked up, seeing him stretch, his face weary but determined. "Finished?" she asked, her voice cold. Jason nodded. "It's all done." She walked over to his desk, picking up the financial report. She skimmed through it quickly, impressed by the accuracy and attention to detail. She could see that he had given everything to this task, just as he had with everything else. But still she couldn't shake the feeling that he was trying to prove something, to her perhaps or to himself. "You did good," Eleanor said, surprising herself with the words. "But don't expect any special treatment." Jason didn't respond, but the faintest hint of relief passed through his expression. It was fleeting, but it was there. He gathered his things and left for the night, leaving Elena alone with her thoughts. She sat in her chair, staring at the empty space where he had just been. Could Jason truly change, or was he still the same? Man who had rejected her all those years ago, trapped in a cycle of pride and regret. One thing was certain, she wasn't ready to let him back in, not yet. But a part of her wondered if, in time, he might just prove that redemption was possible, even for someone like him. Days turned into weeks, and Jason continued to prove himself. He wasn't just meeting expectations, he was exceeding them. The reports, the proposals, even the smallest administrative tasks were completed with precision. His work ethic was undeniable, but Elena remained cold, distant. She kept him at arm's length, unwilling to allow him to break through the barriers she had carefully built over the years. Yet, there were moments, fleeting as they were, when she found herself watching him more intently than she intended. Like when she caught him staying late again, his face illuminated by the soft glow of his desk lamp, his tired eyes fixed on the screen in front of him. Or when he would catch her, gaze across the office, offering her a polite nod that she couldn't help but return. It was nothing more than professionalism, of course. Nothing more than the unspoken acknowledgement that they were both trying to build something out of the wreckage of their past. But even the smallest gestures spoke volumes. Elena found herself thinking about him more than she cared to admit. He had changed, yes, but was it enough? Was it enough for her to let go of the past? Was it enough for her to even consider the possibility of forgiveness? One day, Elena walked into the break room to find Jason standing by the coffee machine, a mug in his hand. The silence between them was heavy, both of them acutely aware of the space that existed between them, unspoken, unresolved. "Long night?" she asked, her voice neutral. Jason glanced at her, the faintest of smiles tugging at his lips. "You could say that. I've been trying to get ahead on some of the new projects." Elena nodded, not sure if she was supposed to be impressed. "Good. Keep it up. You're doing well." He took a sip from his mug, then set it down on the counter. "I'm doing more than that, Elena. I'm trying to prove something." Her eyes narrowed. "Prove something. To me. To yourself." "To both of us," Jason said, his gaze unwavering. "I know I hurt you. I know I did wrong by you, and I'm not asking you to forget that. But I am asking for a chance. Not for your pity. Not for forgiveness, at least not yet, but for the opportunity to show you that I've changed, that I'm not the man I was." Elena swallowed hard. She had heard these words before, from men who thought they could charm their way back into her life, from men who believed that time could erase their mistakes. But Jason was different. She saw the sincerity in his eyes, the way he wasn't just saying what he thought she wanted to hear. He was laying himself bare in a way that no one had ever dared to do with her. He wasn't trying to win her back with grand gestures or empty promises. He was simply asking for a chance to prove himself, and that, more than anything, made her pause. She had spent so long building walls around herself, guarding her heart with the kind of ferocity that only those who had been hurt could understand. But could she really continue to deny the possibility of change? Could she keep pushing him away, knowing that maybe, just maybe, he had learned something in the years that had passed? The silence between them stretched, filled with questions neither of them had the answers to. Finally, Elena spoke, her voice soft but firm. "Prove it," she said. "Show me that you've changed. Show me that you're not the same man who rejected me all those years ago, and maybe then we'll see if there's any chance for you, any chance for us." Jason's eyes shone with something deeper than relief. It was hope, a hope he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. He nodded slowly, his voice steady. I'll prove it, Elena, I promise." Elena turned to leave the break room, her heart beating just a little faster than it should have. It wasn't a promise of forgiveness, not yet. But it was something that made her question whether she had been too quick to close the door on the man who had once been her world. As she walked back to her office, Elena found herself thinking about the past, about the life she had built without him. Could she really open herself up again? Could she allow him back in, not just as a colleague, but as something more? The questions gnawed at her, but one thing was certain. Jason Warren was no longer the same man who had rejected her. Whether that was enough to undo the years of hurt, Elena didn't know. But she was starting to wonder if, just maybe, there was a chance for something new to grow between them. The marketing campaign was a success, far beyond what either Elena or Jason had anticipated. His strategy, though unconventional in parts, hit all the right notes and the results spoke for themselves. The company saw a significant increase in engagement, and the new product line was more successful than anyone had imagined. Jason's hard work was undeniable, and for the first time Elena found herself feeling a sense of pride in his accomplishments. But with success came new challenges. As the campaign rolled out, Elena's attention was divided between overseeing the company's growth and managing the increasingly complex dynamic with Jason. He had earned his place in the company, but every time they shared a victory, there was an underlying tension that neither of them could ignore. Jason's success was impossible to ignore. As he gained confidence, there were moments when their professional relationship seemed to blur, just for an instant. It wasn't as if they were suddenly friends or as if everything had been forgiven, but the way they worked together was different. There was a subtle connection, an unspoken understanding that neither of them fully acknowledged, but it was there. One evening, as the office began to empty out, Eleanor stayed behind, catching up on paperwork. She glanced at the clock, almost midnight. Her head was pounding, and she was feeling the weight of the long days catching up to her. The door to her office creaked open, and Jason stepped in, his face tired but determined. "You're still here?" he asked, his tone more casual than usual. Elena looked up, surprised by the familiarity in his voice. It wasn't quite the professional distance they usually maintained. "I've got a lot to finish," she replied, though her voice lacked the usual edge. Jason nodded, moving toward her desk. "I was going to ask if you wanted to grab a drink or something, but I can see you've got your hands full." She hesitated for a moment. Part of her wanted to turn him away, to keep the lines firmly drawn between them. But another part, something she hadn't been able to silence for weeks now, wanted to accept. To step out of the business world for a moment and just breathe. "Maybe for a few minutes," she said, surprising herself. "I'm almost done here." Jason's eyes softened, and for the first time in a long while, Eleanor felt a sense of comfort from his presence. It wasn't just professional admiration anymore. There was something else, a quiet, growing connection between them. They walked together to the nearby bar, just a few blocks from the office. The soft murmur of the crowd and the clink of glasses filled the space, but it was just the two of them at that moment, sitting across from each other, the world outside forgotten. "So, tell me," Jason began, his voice relaxed now. "How did you manage to turn all this into something so, well, successful?" Elena leaned back in her chair, studying him. "I worked for it. Nothing in this world comes easy, and nothing worth having is handed to you on a silver platter." Jason chuckled. "I remember when you said that to me years ago. I guess you were right. I didn't appreciate it back then." Elena's eyes narrowed slightly. "No, you didn't." There was no malice in her tone, but the words still carried the weight of everything that had passed between them. Jason sighed, his gaze dropping to his drink. "I'm sorry, I know that doesn't fix anything, but I really am. I didn't see you. Not the way I should have." Eleanor took a deep breath, exhaling slowly. "I don't need an apology, Jason. What's done is done. It's the actions now that matter." He met her eyes again, his expression sincere. "I know. And I'm doing everything I can to show you that I'm not the same person anymore. That I'm not just asking for a chance for myself, but for us, maybe even for something more." Elena's heart skipped a beat, but she kept her face neutral. This was exactly where things had started to blur before. She had worked so hard to protect herself from moments like this, to keep her focus solely on the business. But now, sitting across from Jason, with his quiet determination and the sincerity in his eyes, she couldn't help but wonder if there was something more to explore. "Let's just focus on the now, Jason," she said, her voice steady, though the slight catch in it betrayed her internal conflict. "We'll figure everything else out later." He nodded, his lips curving into a faint smile. "Fair enough." The rest of the evening passed in comfortable silence, and when they returned to the office, it was with a renewed sense of understanding between them. There was no immediate resolution, no grand promises, But for the first time, Elena realized that there was a possibility, a small but real possibility, that maybe they could both move forward, not just as colleagues, but as something more. But what that future held, neither of them knew. The days following their conversation at the bar were filled with a quiet kind of tension, one that neither of them seemed eager to acknowledge. They continued their work, side by side, as though nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The connection between them, once buried deep under layers of professional distance and old wounds, was beginning to surface. Jason threw himself into the work, pouring his energy into the upcoming product launch. Elena couldn't deny the shift in his attitude. He wasn't just doing his job, he was taking ownership. The once arrogant CEO was now a determined employee, and it was beginning to show in the results. His work was impeccable, his leadership, skills undeniable. Yet every time Elena caught his eye in the hallway, or when their paths crossed in the break room, there was something unspoken hanging between them. She could feel it, an electric charge that neither of them dared to acknowledge. Elena had always been the type to keep her emotions in check. She had built her life around ambition, around building something of her own, without relying on anyone. But now, as she watched Jason rise in the ranks, her feelings became more difficult to ignore. Was it possible that they were both moving towards something they hadn't expected? Could she allow herself to be vulnerable again, to trust him after everything that had happened? One afternoon, as she was reviewing a new project proposal, Elena's phone buzzed on her desk. She glanced at the screen, her heart skipping a beat when she saw Jason's name. He had sent her a message, one that felt different from the usual. Professional exchanges. "Elena, we need to talk. Please meet me after work. There's something I need to say." Her pulse quickened. She wasn't sure what to make of it, but the urgency in his message left her with no choice but to agree. She typed a quick response. "I'll meet you at 7 p.m. in the conference room." When she arrived at the conference room later that evening, Jason was already there, standing by the window, looking out at the city below. The man who had once seemed so confident now seemed lost in thought, as if he were trying to gather the right words to say. "Jason," Elena said softly, stepping into the room. He turned, his expression more vulnerable than she had ever seen it before. "Elena," he replied, his voice quiet. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." She nodded, crossing her arms over her chest, her eyes searching his face. "What is this about?" Jason hesitated for a moment, his gaze falling to the floor before meeting hers again. "I can't keep pretending like everything's just business between us. Not anymore." Elena's heart skipped. She opened her mouth to respond, but he continued, speaking faster now, as if the words were rushing out before he could stop them. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, and I'm not asking for it. But what I'm asking for is a chance for something more than just this. I've spent so much time trying to fix my mistakes, to redeem myself, that I didn't stop to think about the one thing I want most." Elena's breath caught in her throat. She knew what was coming, but part of her wasn't ready to hear it. Part of her wanted to step back, to keep the walls up and protect herself from the possibility of disappointment. But another part of her, the part that had spent years burying feelings for him, couldn't help but listen, couldn't help but feel the warmth in his words. "I want you, Elena," Jason said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I know it's complicated, and I know it might be too late, but I can't deny how I feel anymore. I've been given a second chance in life, and if there's one thing I know for sure, it's that I don't want to spend it without you." The room was silent. Elena could feel her heart racing, her thoughts spinning. This wasn't just a confession, it was a revelation, one that forced her to confront everything she had been avoiding. The years of pain, the betrayal, the guarded heart she had built to protect herself from him. And now, standing before her, Jason was asking for something that until now she had never considered. Her trust, her heart, a second chance. Elena took a deep breath, her mind running through 100 different thoughts, 100 different scenarios. She wanted to say something, to respond, but the words stuck in her throat. She had built so much, and for so long she had told herself she didn't need him. But now, in this moment, the possibility of something more between them felt too real to ignore. She took a step forward, closing the distance between them. "Jason," she began, her voice soft but firm. "I can't promise you anything right now, but I will say this. You've earned a chance, and that's all you're getting." Jason's face softened, a mixture of relief and gratitude flooding his features. "That's all I need," he said, his voice low. As Elena looked into his eyes, she realized that for the first time in years, she wasn't just seeing the man who had hurt her. She was seeing someone who had fought for redemption, who had worked harder than anyone else to earn back her respect. And maybe, just maybe, he had earned a place in her heart again. The weeks that followed their conversation in the conference room were filled with a quiet, tentative change. Elena and Jason didn't rush anything. There were no grand declarations of love, no sweeping gestures. Instead, they began to rebuild, slowly, cautiously. Their professional relationship remained as strong as ever, but now there was something more, something that neither of them had expected. Jason continued to prove himself at work. The success of the marketing campaign had solidified his place in the company, and Elena found herself relying on him more and more. He wasn't just a competent employee anymore. He was an integral part of her team. His leadership, his dedication, and his new sense of humility made him a force to be reckoned with. And for the first time, Elena began to think about him not just as a colleague, but as someone who had become a part of her world in ways she hadn't anticipated. One evening, as they sat in her office discussing a new project, the air between them felt different. It wasn't the same professional tension that had once defined their interactions. This time it was softer, more intimate. Two people who had shared something painful, something real, and had emerged from it stronger. Elena looked up from the papers on her desk, her gaze meeting Jason's. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice steady but carrying a hint of vulnerability she rarely allowed herself to show. "You've done a lot to prove yourself, not just to me, but to yourself. And I think I've been afraid. Afraid of letting go of the past, of trusting you again." Jason nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "I don't expect you to forget, Elena. I know I can't erase the past, but I can work every day to show you that I'm not the same man who hurt you. I want you to know that." For a long moment, they just looked at each other, the silence between them comfortable, even peaceful. Elena felt the walls she had built around her heart begin to shift. She wasn't ready to throw herself fully into something new, not yet, but there was a sense of peace in knowing that they could move forward, not just as co-workers, but as two people who had learned, grown, and evolved. Jason leaned forward, his voice quiet, but filled with sincerity. "We don't need to rush, Elena. We've already been through enough. But if you're willing, I'd like to try to build something together, not just in business, but in life." Elena's heart skipped a beat, and for the first time in years, she felt the weight of her past lifting. She wasn't sure where this new path would lead, but she knew that whatever happened, they would face it together. The past would always be there, but it no longer had to define their future. With a soft smile, Elena closed the distance between them, her voice steady but warm. "Let's see where this takes us, one step at a time." Jason smiled, the kind of smile that spoke of understanding, of patience, and of hope. "I'm in," he said, his voice filled with determination. And as they sat there, side by side, Elena realized that sometimes the best things in life came from the most unexpected places. And maybe, just maybe, the man who had once rejected her love had become the person she needed in her life all along. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button to show your support. It truly helps me bring more impactful stories to you. If you haven't already, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss out on more emotional, thought-provoking tales. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. Comment below and share what part of the story touched you most, or how it made you feel. Your feedback means the world and shapes the future of the channel. Thank you for being part of this community.